people continue to trickle in as we get started, but since y'all were so late coming from the first service, that we've got to get going. So welcome to week 5. It's a little chilly in here, so that might be appropriate. We'll warm things up either because of the subject or because of the hot air coming from the front of the class. So we've spent 3 weeks talking about eternal conscious torment in some form or another. So now we're going to move away from that happy subject to something called annihilationism. So things are just getting better and better here. So before we get started, I have my usual clip. This is not, sorry to say, not a funny clip from a sitcom. This is a more serious clip from a movie that came out in 2012 called Hell and Mr. Fudge. Mr. Fudge being Edward Fudge, who is a Church of Christ minister and scholar who kind of literally wrote the book on annihilationism or conditional immortality. And so I wanted to show a clip from this because it's sort of one of the key events in his life that sort of led him to rethink his traditional views of hell.
My very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas.
Oh, I get it.
Hello, boys. How's it going?
I just learned all the planets in 1 minute.
Well, that's fine, son. Henry, I need to talk to Edwin. Go see if your mother needs some help. Thank you, son.
What's going on?
Come sit. You know David Hollis, don't you?
Sure, he's a good friend.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just got off the phone with his mother.
What do you do, leave town already?
No, there was a car accident.
What happened?
Well, apparently he lost control out on Old 14 near Haggett's Creek. His pickup flipped over into a ditch and pinned him underneath.
Is he okay?
They say he died instantly. I'm sorry, son. I am truly sorry.
Where is he?
What?
Where's Davy now?
Well, he's at the Curtis Funeral Home. They're preparing him for services.
That's not what I mean. Is he in hell? Is Davy in hell?
Well, was Davy baptized?
No.
It's a tragic thing to die without knowing the Lord.
Then that's what you're saying. That Davy's burning in hell.
It's not what I say. The Bible is clear on that point. Sin is abhorrent to God, and the wages of sin is death.
He's gonna burn forever for just wanting to see the world.
Well, I don't claim to have all the answers. I wish I did.
All right. So not quite as funny as previous clips I've shown in this class. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's, so as I said, this is from a movie, which is actually, for a movie about a scholar rethinking his ideas of hell, it's actually not too bad of a movie. But it is a movie about a scholar studying hell, so it's not like the best movie either. But it's worth a watch if you're interested. But we'll talk more about Edward Fudge in a second. I wanted to recap a little bit since we're going into week 5 out of 6. So it can sort of start to. So the book he wrote was The Fire That Consumes. So this is the class that consumes. Hopefully in a good way. So what we've learned so far is that half of you are monsters. No, that's a joke. Half of you, roughly half of you, said that you believe in eternal conscious torment. The other half, more or less, said that you believe that there's no hell at all. And we talked a little bit about how that might actually be the same view, and people are just sort of breaking down, depending on how you sort of parse the language there. But which I think sort of shows that there's a lot of gray and a lot of nuance in people's views on this. We talked a little bit about the lenses that we wear in sort of two different contexts. The lenses we wear is based on how we grew up and the culture we live in, but also, we'll talk more about this in a little bit, the lenses we wear in that we come to the Bible with a belief, with a set of beliefs, and then we have verses that support those beliefs, and then we read all the other verses that may or may not support those beliefs through the lenses of those initial verses that we already agree with. We talked about how hell is for other people. It's 99.5% of Americans believe they are not going to hell. So that means that hell, when we talk about it, is not something that we think is going to happen to us. It's something we think is going to happen to other people, which makes it really important how we talk about it, how we think about it, because it'll affect how we think about other people. We talked about kind of the roots of hell, in the Valley of Hinnom, the place where child sacrifice took place, which was then known as a place of fire, and then God's promise to punish the people who were sacrificing children there. So it became sort of associated with fire and judgment, transliterated into the Greek as Gehenna, and then translated again into English as hell. And then we talked about how that concept kind of got built on and justified by AAA. You might remember Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, especially in the Middle Ages, to kind of create the views that we sort of have in our culture of eternal conscious torment. But we talked about the justifications for eternal conscious torment are not necessarily biblical. They were all developed to justify a concept that they believed was biblical. But the justifications themselves, that is necessary for evangelism, that it's necessary to reveal the glory of God, those sorts of things not necessarily found in the Bible. And I think we all agreed more or less on this, that it's really hard to reconcile the view in the Bible that God is love, that God is merciful, gracious, full of compassion, is good, with eternal conscious torment, unless you have free will as a way to sort of make that work, that people sort of send themselves, that it's not necessarily that God is doing it. We'll continue to talk about that in this class as well. So before I move on, do I want to do that? Yes. Any questions or thoughts before we move on to the rest of the class here? Is this a little summary? Good, because we're running behind. So last week I told you that we were going to talk a little bit about these verses and sort of introduce a little bit of doubt into some of these verses that seem to support eternal conscious torment. So we showed these in week 2. We have the notion of Gehenna here, where the worm never dies and the fire is never quenched, which is a direct quote of Isaiah 66. And then we have in Matthew 25, Jesus condemning the nations, depart from me into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. 2 Thessalonians, we have the notion of the punishment of eternal destruction, separated from the presence of the Lord and the glory of his might. Jude talks about a punishment of eternal fire like Sodom and Gomorrah suffered. And Jesus has lots of verses where he talks about people being thrown into the outer darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth, and we'll talk about those in a little bit as well. So let's talk a little bit about Gehenna and Jerusalem, because Gehenna, remember, is the Valley of Hinnom, which is outside Jerusalem. It's actually a physical place, and so when we see hell, we think metaphysical afterlife, but Gehenna is actually referring to a literal valley that has specific connotations for the people who heard it. And so it's a physical location. Does it necessarily mean that it is a metaphysical forever location? Maybe it doesn't. And the reason why it might not is because Jesus uses a lot of apocalyptic imagery. And we learned in the Revelation class we had last year, if you remember, that the apocalypse genre, Jewish genre of literature that was very popular in sort of the last little bit, a couple centuries before Jesus was born, the century or so afterwards. And apocalypses use really stylized, symbolic, sort of out-of-this-world imagery to discuss this-world events, especially to audiences that feel like that are oppressed, that feel like they're not getting justice in this world, and it sort of acts as a way to sort of say, hey, you might not be getting justice here, but you will get justice later. God's going to come and sort of take care of business, and he uses highly symbolic language for that. Jesus does that. He talks about the sun going dark, the moon turning to blood. He talks about how this generation will not pass before these things happen. And so there is room when he's talking about things like Gehenna and eternal fire and the outer darkness. It might be sort of in line with this apocalyptic imagery that Jesus uses, and this is N.T. Wright's argument as well. And so I kind of want to, I've mentioned before in different classes that how, just like the Old Testament is the best way, I think, to view the Old Testament is to sort of understand that all of it is affected by the fall of Jerusalem and the exile of the Israelites to Babylon. All of the Old Testament was at least compiled and edited and finalized in light of the exile, even if parts of it were written beforehand. It's all viewed through that lens, that question of why did our God lose to these Babylonian gods? And similarly, the New Testament is sort of overshadowed by the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in the year 70. But the New Testament never actually mentions the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in the year 70, even though several books, including at least 3 of the 4, if not all 4 Gospels, are written after that Jerusalem is destroyed. So there's shadows of it all over the New Testament, like when Jesus says that the temple is going to be destroyed and there's not one stone left on top of the other. Just like when in the later writings attributed to Paul, they basically says, yeah, the Jews rejected Jesus and they got the punishment that was coming to them. There are pieces of it that you can kind of see there. And so when Jesus, the gospel is being written either just before or after the fall of Jerusalem, and you have Jesus in there sort of in this culture where the Jews are very upset about Roman rule. If you're old enough at this time, you remember when you had your own country that was independent as a result of the Maccabean revolt. We talked about this during the Revelation class. It didn't take a whole lot of close observation if you were living at the time of Jesus to understand that there was a lot of political volatility and restlessness going on in Jerusalem and in Palestine at that time. And depending on what happened, Rome was going to come in and take care of that volatility one way or the other. And eventually they did after the Jewish revolt. And Rome came in and basically destroyed Jerusalem. And that was a catalyst for the spread of Christianity through the empire, because the Jews who were following Jesus and believed that Jesus was the Messiah no longer had a reason to stick around. They kind of had to get out. And so for no other reason than the spread of Christianity, this became kind of a big deal. So it's worth kind of keeping that in mind when we talk about Gehenna and this idea of Gehenna, a valley outside of Jerusalem, being a place of punishment. Because it very well may be that the destruction of Jerusalem itself is what's in mind there. The other big thing that we want to keep in mind is that we in our Bibles see the word eternal or everlasting all the time. Well, that word in Greek is aionios. It's in those 2 verses in Matthew that I quoted earlier. But that does not actually mean, it's not a quantity word. It doesn't mean lasting forever. It means, it's also everlasting life in John 3:16. But a better definition of it is having the quality of the age to come. It's not a quantity word, it's a quality word. So when it talks about eternal life or eternal fire, it might mean forever. But it could also mean taking place in the age to come. It could mean having the quality, so not something like you'd see in your ordinary everyday fire in this age, but something more divine. And so that's kind of a big deal, because when we see things like eternal darkness or eternal fire, it doesn't necessarily mean forever. It could mean it has a limited duration, but it's taking place in the next age, or it has a specific quality to it that we would not experience in this age. So that's kind of a big deal. And then finally, the last 2 verses that I quoted were the ones in Revelation, the lake of fire and the smoke going up forever and ever. Probably the key verses that sort of give us our traditional view of hell. And so we'll talk about those next week, so you'll have to come back. Because Universalists actually have an interpretation of those verses that they would argue makes them stronger evidences for universal reconciliation than for eternal conscious torment. And so you'll have to come back and find out what those are. So there's our usual Far Side comic, the whispering in the back, I hate this place. As if, that's sort of the point. So conditional immortality or annihilationism, I go back and forth because I don't want to, I assume that people who believe in annihilationism would prefer the phrase conditional immortality because that just sounds better than annihilation. But the basic idea is that, the argument is that immortality of the soul is a Greek assumption. It comes from Greek philosophy. It does not necessarily come from the Hebrew Bible. And immortality is a gift from God. And so the idea then is that those who are saved, however that happens, again, we're not going to get into how that works, but if you are saved and you are given the gift of immortality, you get everlasting life. Everybody who's not saved, they simply die. Now, and the question then is, do they die when they die, or do they go to hell to sort of work out the punishment for the sins that they committed and then they die? But at some point, their soul is eventually annihilated and destroyed. So that's why they call it conditional immortality. So this is, now that we get away from eternal conscious torment into these other views, I wanted to point out there are actually lists of verses that seem to support all three of these views of hell. So the question then is, which verses are we using to interpret the other verses through? So if we are always thinking eternal conscious torment, we will read these verses in light of that. There's no real reason to do that. And so we're going to look at some of these verses that the annihilationists argue actually would make this a more logical starting point than this. So Edward Fudge talks about, when he talks about these lenses, he says in this book here that advocates of everlasting torment read the Old Testament, they don't find the review in it, and they conclude that it has nothing to say. And this is how this works, not just on this subject, but a lot of different subjects. When we read the Bible, we come to it with an assumption or a belief, and we read everything through the lens of that assumption. And if it might actually say something, but we sort of disregard it and ignore it because it doesn't seem to support the view that we already hold. And that's the case here because, in fact, the Old Testament, I forgot to do that, the Old Testament has a lot to say about what happens to the wicked. Right? Just in the Psalms alone, it says the wicked will wither, be no more, perish, vanish, be destroyed, broken in pieces, slain, cut off, blotted out. Nowhere does it say they're going to live forever while suffering. So his argument is, look, from the very beginning in the Old Testament, there is an argument that the Bible is making for what happens to the wicked. It is that they basically disappear. In Isaiah, we have this is one of the key verses that is in the Old Testament, sort of makes it sound maybe like sort of eternal conscious tormenty. Their worm shall not die, the fire will not be quenched. And Fudge's argument here is that, well, first of all, this is talking about corpses. The people that have been thrown into the valley. It's not living people, so there's no consciousness in play here. So there can't be torment. And the other thing is that the worm shall not die and the fire will not be quenched forever or until the job gets done, right? And so once the bodies are consumed, then the worm and the fire are irrelevant. And so that is the argument here as well, that it sounds like it's talking about eternality, but it's actually that the consequences are eternal, but the actual act that's taking place is temporary. And we'll talk some more about that in a little bit. This is some disagreements in the disagreement in the text. I tried, but I do this late at night, so I can't be held responsible. From that point, there's a disagreement in the text from once the Old Testament is sort of concluded and then the New Testament starts. There's obviously sort of a traditionally called 400 years of silence, even though it's not actually 400 years and it's not actually that silent. But in that period, there are a lot of texts. And those texts are really important because they tell us sort of what the level of Jewish thought was about different subjects by the time Jesus' thoughts are being recorded in the Gospels. And so rabbis are sort of disagreeing on the permanence of Gehenna by the time that Jesus is around. And even centuries after Jesus is around, you have rabbis who believe that Gehenna is forever, that Gehenna is temporary, and the souls within it disappear. And there are some that say Gehenna is temporary and that all the souls in it are eventually reconciled to God. These are all three already all in existence in Jewish thought by the time that Jesus is around. The Dead Sea Scrolls seem to believe the sort of separatist group that ran into the desert to avoid what was going to happen in Jerusalem and kind of separate themselves from this world. They had their own writings that indicated that the fire consumed. You have a mix of views in these intertestamental writings, the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, which are in our, the Apocrypha is in our Bibles in sort of like a subset. And then the Pseudepigrapha, which are Jewish writings that are sort of attributed to people like Moses and Abraham, very clearly not written by those people, but certainly deliver ideas of Jewish thought at the time in between the Old and New Testament. They also had a mix of views. There's no real agreement about the future of the damned at the time that Jesus is around. And so what did Jesus think? And so the verses I showed you would think, well, Jesus took the eternal conscious torment position. But but first of all, maybe not, because he uses the word aionios, which does not necessarily mean forever, and maybe not because he's using apocalyptic language that might be referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. But also when he talks about weeping and gnashing of teeth and people being thrown out into the outer darkness, it's worth pointing out that in John 3:16, everybody's favorite verse, whoever believes in him will not perish, right? Will not die, will not suffer eternally in hell, right? Sometimes we should, this is Edward Fudge's argument, we should, take the words at their word. It's the word perish. It means die. It does not mean suffer forever. 7 times Jesus talks about weeping and gnashing of teeth, but only 2 out of those 7 times is it connected to fire in any way. So that's kind of interesting. And the other thing we need to remember is that gnashing does not mean torment, which I think we think about gnashing of teeth as people like grinding or like chomping their teeth because of the pain they're experiencing. But it's used a different time in the New Testament, and that's in Acts, when Stephen's about to be stoned. And he sort of delivers his vision about how all of the elders and the people who are sort of in charge there are all the ways that they are wrong, and they get really mad and they gnash their teeth and then they throw rocks at him. And so gnashing means that people are angry, not that they are being tormented, which maybe brings into view a little more of maybe that C.S. Lewis idea, right? People sort of are choosing their own fate. They're in the outer darkness and they're angry at God for being there, not necessarily that they're being tormented. And so this gets back to that idea of it's not necessarily that there is no hell and people are not suffering consequences in hell, but it might be that the consequences are what is eternal and not necessarily the act of punishment. So, the idea here that what is destroyed is certainly destroyed forever. But the act of destruction does not keep going. He quotes somebody in this book here of a preacher who was asked, well, with the gnashing of teeth, like what happens when they've ground their teeth to nothing? Do they still keep gnashing their teeth? And somebody's like, well, I guess God just gives them a new set of teeth. And it's like, well, maybe, the fire, the act of destruction somehow miraculously keeps going. Augustine and Aquinas certainly had to deal with that objection, and they had ideas for how that worked. And they basically amount to, God can do what God wants, which is true, but it might be that it's the act of destruction is temporary, but of course anything that is destroyed forever. And we see that, right? Because Jude 7 talks about Sodom and Gomorrah experiencing eternal fire, but we can't go over there and see them still burning. The fire's out, and it was out the day after, according to Genesis, right? So, is that Genesis? Yeah. So it might be that the fire has a quality of the age to come. It might be taking place in the age to come. It might be that the destruction actually does last forever and is therefore eternal, but the burning itself does not. But they're also not still standing, right? They are destroyed. And so we have these verses in the New Testament that talk about what happens to the people who do not follow Jesus. And over it says, they perish, they die. In Hebrews, our God is a consuming fire, right? That's why The Fire That Consumes is the title of Edward Fudge's book. And then finally, maybe one of the more famous books in the Bible, verses in the Bible, Romans 6:23, the wages of sin are eternal conscious torments? No, the wages of sin are death. But the gift of God is eternal life. So the juxtaposition is almost always between death and life, not between life and really bad life. And before Tertullian came along, we talked about him in the Eternal Conscious Torment section, we actually have several works written after the sort of the close of the New Testament canon that seem to believe annihilationism as well. Although, like I said in the previous class, this is not something that is really focused on. They sort of talk about it on their way to making other points, which is worth remembering as well. But in the Didache, which is again one of those writings that just missed the cut in the New Testament, written right around 100, like the Book of Revelation, like some of the later writings in the New Testament, was used by some early churches alongside books that are currently in the Bible, but just didn't quite make it for whatever reasons as the canon was being put together over the next couple hundred years. But at the very beginning it says, and the Didache just means the teachings, and it's the teachings of the 12. It's supposed to be teachings of the disciples of Jesus. There are two ways, the way of life and the way of eternal consciousness. No, the way of death. Ignatius, one of the most famous of the second generation of Christians, who his tradition holds was a disciple of John. In the early 100s, he's been sentenced to die. He's being carried by the Romans back to Rome for his execution, and he's writing letters to the various churches that he passes through on his way from Antioch to Rome. Two things lie before us: life and death. Not eternal conscious torment. Justin Martyr, who actually brings in a lot of Greek philosophy in defending Christianity, one of the first apologists for Christianity living in the 2nd century until he was, as you might suspect from the name, martyred, says, he's the most explicit, says the wicked are punished so long as God wills to have them exist. So there's definitely an idea of annihilationism, of conditional immortality in play in the first couple of centuries after Jesus. Tertullian really changes all of that because Tertullian brings in the Greek philosophical notion of the immortality of the soul, and I sort of summarized his arguments in week 2, the idea that he can't wait to see these people who've been persecuting him burn forever. He's so excited. And Tertullian really sort of changes the game. And then after Tertullian, you have Augustine and then Anselm and Aquinas. And by the Middle Ages, it is set in stone, eternal conscious torment. And really for 1,700 years, there is not really any talk that I was able to find in my, not incredibly thorough, but I looked around and tried to find some, of not a whole lot of annihilationism, conditional immortality. The notion of the immortality of the soul is so locked in, even still, to our assumptions. That eternal conscious torment just made the most sense to the most people for 1,700 years until this pleasant-looking gentleman came along. Henry grew. I hope so. Most of us do grow over time. My kids love me at home. But in 1837, he writes. He's I think Baptist, and he's sort of. And he's also an abolitionist, and this is right around that time in the 19th century when people are really, fully immersed in the idea like, hey, anybody can read the Bible and figure it out for themselves, especially in the Baptist tradition and some of these very distinctly American traditions. And he sort of says, I can't go with a lot of these doctrines that I was taught, and one of them is eternal conscious torment. I think hell destroys the soul, and it doesn't last forever. So he writes a pamphlet about it, and somebody leaves that pamphlet on a train, and so George Storrs picks it up and he reads it. He's like, yeah, I think that's right. Well, George Storrs is a member of a sect called the Millerites. So the Millerites were one of numerous groups that sort of followed a very charismatic individual who sort of, deviated from traditional Christianity in certain ways. They often made predictions about the end of the world and when Jesus was coming back. The Millerites, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Scientology, Mormonism, all of these groups that come into being in the 19th century are all part of this sort of the same, they're all drinking the same water. The Millerites have some trouble because Mr. Miller did predict twice wrongly that Jesus was going to come back in the 1840s. That didn't work out very well for them. And so one of the larger groups that sort of broke away from the Millerites were the Seventh-day Adventists. And the Seventh-day Adventists kind of had this notion of annihilationism, and sort of they were the ones that sort of brought it back into the discussion in American Christianity. And then for 100 years, it kind of just sat percolating. And so today, though, we have a few different people. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this all sort of started in the 1960s. Because that's another time when people are really reconsidering the things that they were taught, whether or not the things their parents and grandparents told them were really the right things. So in the 60s, in Pentecostal William Brenham, an Anglican named John Wenham in 1974, the Church of Christ, Edward Fudge in 1982, where he wrote The Fire That Consumes, and finally, probably most famously, the evangelical Anglican John Stott in 1988 wrote his book advocating for this. All of them conservative, because I think the argument is that the Bible says this is the thing, and so because it's a very high view of the Bible, you tend to have more evangelical and conservative people sort of looking at this and saying, no, the Bible says this, and this is what we're going to say. By the 1960s, a lot of mainliners like Episcopalians and Presbyterians probably already just jumped over this and said, hell is really problematic, and so they're more likely to be universalists or maybe not believe in hell at all. So that's kind of where we're at today. And so now that I've sort of blurted all that out, hope you all are taking copious notes, I have a question for you. Is it that much better than eternal conscious torment? Is annihilationism. Is this idea any better or a lot better? Does it solve the problems that we talked about with eternal conscious torment? Well, I would say yes and no. Right? One of the big arguments that Ansel made that is still used today to justify eternal conscious torment is, right, a sin against an infinite being requires infinite punishment. Well, you know, I think we all agree that that was kind of weird. And that the big question of justice was that if you're sinning in a finite universe, how can you be punished infinitely? And this takes care of that, right? The punishment is no longer infinite. There's still a problem, I think, maybe with the joy of the redeemed. So if you're up there in heaven and there's no crying and no mourning and you're supposed to be perfectly happy, but you know somebody's burning in hell, that's a problem. If you know they're burning in hell forever, that's also a problem. If you know that they're burning in hell and at some point they sort of just wink out of existence, I would expect us to mourn them, right? They've died, just like we mourn people who have died in this life. And so I think that question of how we treat the damned as people living in heaven is still a problem, maybe not as big of a one. Certainly, it does not solve the question of whether or not punishment should be retributive or restorative, right? This is very much still retribution. There's no release back into society. There's no reformation. You're not restored to anybody. You're paying your debt that you accumulated in this life, and then you're gone. So instead of it being eternal punishment, it's capital punishment. And I don't know if we like capital punishment that much. And, you know, we need to kind of think about that. Maybe we do. I don't know. Death still kind of runs the show, right? Your fate is still, this is another thing we flagged. Your fate still determined basically what on the state of your soul at the time that you die. And maybe not. Maybe there's a notion again of people post-mortem can kind of get themselves out of hell, but that still becomes very much a death-centered faith. And then finally, and this is the question, it might be more compatible, but is it at all, or is it fully compatible with the notion of God's love, mercy, graciousness? Do we think it is or not?
No. It seems like it's really not, because if you think of, does the punishment fit the crime? If sin is sin, it seems pretty unfair that any small sin will lead you to annihilation,
right,
as would any
big
top 10.
So it becomes, if you've never murdered anybody, and then which, we've all had our moments, but, if we've never murdered anybody, then every sin is a capital punishment sin, regardless of whether or not it's,
I think at least with eternal conscious torment, we convince ourselves that it will be like a different kind of torment depending on.
Yeah, depending on, right. So then it's just a matter of how long, right? Yeah.
Not that I believe that, but I think that.
I think all of those questions we have about eternal conscious torment are still there because we're still talking about conscious torment, right? I don't know that there's a world in which we're like, well, torture is not that bad, right? I mean, we have. whole like systems in place to try to keep people from torturing other people. Like, you know, that's kind of like we all agree that torture is like the worst thing you can do short of actually killing somebody. And sometimes it's worse than killing somebody, right? So this I think it still becomes a bit of a problem. And one of the ways that is I think I pulled out this quote from, and this is Hell, a Final Word. So Edward Fudge wrote The Fire That Consumes, which is like a 500-page book, and it's very academic and very, you know. So this is a much easier book to read. It's very much smaller, and it's written in sort of, you know, lay language, and it's sort of part autobiography, memoir, part the kind of summary of the arguments that he kind of developed for this. So it's a good book, worth reading if you're interested in the subject. And he says, the book you're reading now is titled Hell, a Final Word. That title reminds us that when hell finally has completed its job, there will be nothing left to say. Everyone who goes there will be gone, entirely and eternally. For everyone who continued throughout life in opposition to God, hell will have become the final word. Well, there's a problem with that, right? Should hell have the final word? No. Wow, there we go. Right, so this is Nick Ansell, he's a theologian and a scholar from Canada. So, grain of salt, but he says the annihilation and destruction of God's good creation is precisely the aim and goal of evil, not evidence of its defeat. So, if hell has the last word, then evil wins, right? That's kind of the idea, and so that's kind of maybe one of the major problems that annihilationism doesn't really answer. And I feel like that's why maybe when we did this survey, that had the least amount of support among the people in this class. And like I said, like any good compromise, nobody likes it. But I think it kind of is like a way station for people who are really dissatisfied with eternal conscious torment. They can't get over the idea of God allowing people to be tortured forever. And so annihilationism at least takes care of that problem in that there's at least a little bit more of a sense of justice there. But I think in the end, people realize that maybe it doesn't work. But I'm not here to convince you that it doesn't work. But I think it doesn't really grapple fully with the questions that are raised by eternal conscious torment. And so people who are troubled by eternal conscious torment usually move along through annihilationism and into something like universal reconciliation. It's a good segue, because we'll talk about that next week. So yeah, it's just about time. So unless anybody has any things they want to throw out there, or anything they want to say, or questions they want to ask here in the next 2 minutes. We went through the welcome introduction, and we did the 3 weeks of eternal conscious torment. So now we've finished up annihilationism. You only have 1 week left. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.